This is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Pay heed all who enter, and beware this podcast. This is the Pay Heed Podcast on the Kansas City Sports Network. I'm Nick Springer, along with Kevin Flaherty. We are brought to you by Emprise Bank, your partner in all things possible, member FDIC. Kevin, how are things going for you, man?
Going pretty well. Was actually just out at Kansas football mega camp. So, again, if I'm, super rosy, then I come by it honestly. I come by it by being out in the sun. So how are things going for you, Nick?
Yeah, honestly, same, man. I played some golf over the weekend, so I got some sun there. I'm getting into golf. I've never really been a huge golf guy, but I'm getting into it a little bit. If anybody has any advice, my drives, they always go right. So that's my issue right now. So if you have any advice on why it goes right, let me know. But yeah, you mentioned the elite camp, and so this is a busy time for KU on the recruiting front. And one thing I don't want to talk about is a potential for a really, really big commitment for KU, and that is an interesting one that kind of was floating around on the peripherals, but seems to be moving more to the forefront. And that is a transfer in Bryce Foster. He is a center out of Texas A&M, into the transfer portal. And this is a really interesting case, Kevin, because for Foster, it's on top of the fact that he's going to be playing football or wants to play football, he's very, very heavy into track and field. Yeah. And was really strong in shot put actually for Texas A&M when he did track and field as well. So his commitment has been kind of delayed a little bit. I think he went and actually witnessed the track and field championships, which happened last week or the week before, and was involved in that. And so this is a player that kind of came into Kansas, or potentially could come into Kansas. It sounds like he went on a visit to KU. And this is a really interesting one because we talked earlier in the spring about sort of the delayed, I'm trying to think of the right word to describe this, sort of the delay of Shane Baumgartner of coming along, the transfer from Tiffin University, D2 transfer at the center position, and how that maybe left some question marks along the offensive line. And Bryce Foster is a player that made 12 starts at Texas A&M last season as a center, and seems like he could potentially step in and start immediately, and all of a sudden you could be looking at a really formidable offensive line for Kansas.
Yeah, it's one of those things that's kind of fortuitous, right? In that we talked about this when Job committed coming out of the spring. You kind of felt like, I don't want to say that everything was perfect, but you didn't really have a whole lot of, sort of glaring needs left. And the biggest glaring need was after Dylan Brooks' injury, you wanted to have somebody, at that edge spot, who could come in and compete, potentially win that job and have some upside there. And by Job wound up, popping it and then coming to Kansas. And so they solved that. I think if you said, hey, what's the number two thing? It was the fact that Shane Baumgartner came in, and not a knock against the kid, he didn't outright win the job. Like I think a lot of people thought he would in the spring with the opportunity that was there. And so that doesn't mean that he won't win the job. That competition is still open. I think there are some options there. Obviously, we talked on this show before, potentially moving Michael Ford to center, being one of those options if it gets to that point. But then all of a sudden you have Bryce Foster out there, and Bryce Foster is a guy, old school people would describe him, I think, as country strong. He's an incredibly powerful guy. You can see it with the shot put. He's a little bit different kind of center than Kansas has had because of that strength. You look at Nowitzki, he was a fairly mobile guy, really a technical guy, and played his angles right. Bryce Foster is a guy that, could be that bouncer that throws somebody up out the club. So no, he's an interesting guy out there. And if Kansas does wind up getting him, I think one of the draws could be the fact that Kansas has a top 15 track program this year, I think. And so when you look at the track program, you look at the opportunity that's there for him to come in with his experience and compete for that center job, potentially win that center job. Then you get to keep Michael Ford at guard. That line, all of a sudden, there's a lot of stability there, I think.
Yeah, a couple of notes on the track front. Like you mentioned, KU top 15 at national tracks as well. And sort of the other school that seemed to be very much in the running for Bryce Foster was Oregon. Oregon finished 27th. And Oregon obviously is historically probably maybe has a little bit more of a track and field history than maybe KU does, but KU was better. And also, I think KU has a big boon with Stanley Redwine, who is a guy that has national team experience. I believe he's going to be coaching the Olympics this year for the track team. So they have those as well that they can help kind of with recruiting on the track and field side. And then obviously the football side, it makes perfect sense, right? It's the perfect fit. I mean, this is a really talented player, obviously played at Texas A&M. And to your point, he's 6'5". I mean, this is a very large, big dude, 6'5", 330. To your point, that I think could be a real bulldozer in the middle of the offensive line for KU. So could be potentially be a huge commitment. And to your point, I think with the idea of what's the biggest needs left for KU kind of coming out of spring after they landed by Job and even an Amir Herring to help shore up the interior depth of their offensive line, I think he would look at two spots. He'd probably look at the tight end position because of the injury to Deshaun Hanukkah. And I think you'd look at the center position because of the fact that, like you mentioned, Shane Bumgardner maybe didn't come in and just outright win the job. And one of the things that's so impressed me about Lance Leipold, or one of the things about Lance Leipold that's been so consistent since his time coming here is, Kevin, he's not afraid to be very, very aggressive when he recognizes an area of need or an area where things can be shored up. You know, I constantly flash back to the 2021 season where Kansas really struggled on special teams. And they went out and got they very, very aggressively went out and tried to solve that issue. And you've seen it time and time again with the staff where when they identify a problem, they are going to really put the full court press on to try to figure out a way to help, whether that's going out and getting somebody from outside the program, be it the transfer portal, or whether that's, shuffling things around interior or internally to try to figure it out. It's something that's really, really impressed me with Lance Leipold in his short tenure at Kansas.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that after this, I'm not sure what your primary issue would be. It would maybe be depth at a spot or two, but as far as the starting lineup or projected starters, you'd feel pretty good. Just to let people know, how strong Bryce Foster is. When you talk to college coaches about how they evaluate people who throw the shot put, some people say if you throw a 40-foot shot, you're pretty strong. Some coaches have 45 feet kind of as that trigger of, okay, if a guy is throwing 45 feet, we're going to take a longer look at him, potentially offer him whatever. Bryce Foster throws through the shot put 71 feet coming out of high school. So you're talking about 45 feet being sort of that tipping point, and then 50 feet being a no doubter, and then he's throwing it 20 feet beyond that. And so, just a really powerful guy. I think you make such a great point. And one of the things that I feel like Lance Leipold has been so genuine and honest about is that the transfer portal has maybe afforded him some opportunities that previous Kansas coaches did not, right? Because you had the scholarship deficit that really harmed them from the Charlie Weiss years on. And it was so tough for them. David Beatty never had a full roster to work with. Les Miles never had a full roster to work with. And when you look at those things, them lifting, sort of the 25-man limit, and then, also the transfer portal, it allowed them to go out and not just solve certain holes, but also sort of fill out the roster. And they've done a good job too, I think. When you go into the portal, you're usually looking for an immediate impact guy, but they've done a really nice job going out and getting multi-year guys, I think, too, to kind of fill out those holes on the roster where you say, hey, we don't maybe have a ton of young guys, in our linebacker room. Let's go get a guy who's got 2 or 3 years left to bring up after the guys that we have. And they've done that really, really well. And if Bryce Foster does wind up choosing Kansas and they wind up sort of in this post-spring transfer portal going with By Job and Bryce Foster, gosh, that's answering your questions in a pretty definitive manner.
Absolutely. A couple other quick recruiting notes on the high school side, as this is a very busy time, as you said, with the second camp wrapping up earlier in the middle of this week for KU. They've got a couple of commits recently. Juju Marks is a big one. Right here, local guy out of Kansas. That's a big one, I think, for Kansas, for fans that are constantly thirsting for KU to bolster their in-state recruiting. I think Marks is certainly, I believe he's a top 5 recruit in the state for the class of 2025. So a big commitment there for KU. Also got a commit from a tight end, Joseph Skipworth, as well. But one thing I did want to ask you, Kevin, about this is you look back at last year at this time for KU, at this time period of June, and it felt like you were getting commitments left and right. Kansas got a bunch of commitments in June last year. So right now, we're about the middle of June right now, and things are a little bit slower. What's kind of your take on that? What's kind of your take on the approach of KU maybe in the high school recruiting class for this upcoming season?
Yeah, I think there are a couple different things. One, they're in some recruiting battles for some pretty good guys, and some of those are going to drag out, a little bit more than what they had. This staff, their biggest strength on the recruiting trail is relationship based, and so they a lot of times are going to do better the longer they're able to relate to, talk to, sort of stretch a recruit out, if you will. And I think that's part of it. So I do think that there are some guys that you're going to see them potentially even go into the fall, still trying to get. I think the other part, Nick, that's really fascinating is how many seniors there are on this Kansas football team. And so you're going to have to fill in those numbers, but at the same time, you're also going to need to fill in a lot of that experience. You have a lot of guys leaving that have played a lot of football. And so Kansas, yes, they're recruiting hard. They're recruiting some guys that are going to be tough to pull because they're in some real battles. But I also think, too, you're probably going to see them hold some scholarships back for the portal this year just because there is going to be such a drop-off in experience when this group leaves. And so I think that's, sort of the full circle, taking it back to Bryce Foster and By Job. One of the things that we've talked about with basketball is, you don't leave any bullets left in your gun when you feel like, hey, there's a potential national title season here. You don't want to not take a guy and then find out you're one guy short in February or March. And I think that Kansas football is kind of gearing up, not necessarily for a national title, but for a season that could be pretty special if they're able to stay healthy. The schedule is, I hate the word easy. I would maybe use the word manageable. They do avoid some of the quote unquote top teams. There's still some really tricky games in there, Nick, but when you look at all of those different things, I think it's a matter of, you don't want to ride forward with a question mark, say at the center position, find out that's not getting answered, and then you wind up not having the season that you maybe could have had if you had answered that question. And so kudos to them with By Job and putting themselves in position with Bryce Foster. They've really gone out to answer kind of the few questions that they have left on a really sort of stacked and experienced roster.
One other quick note on the high school recruiting front. I'll just say this. I also think part of it just comes with the fact that, listen, you're Kansas. You're no longer one of the worst teams in the country.
Sure.
Like you're recruiting a better quality of player out of high school. That means you're going to be recruiting against some more tougher programs, and those recruitments may draw out a little bit because they're going to be tighter, right? So that was kind of my thought as well on that also. And Kevin, believe it or not, we are 11 weeks away. Start football season. 11 weeks. I know it sounds bad. But we're getting there. We're getting there. We're exactly 11 weeks.
Sounds better each week.
It does. We're getting better each week. And with each week that continues, we're going to be continuing with a Jayhawk Rewind as well here on the Paid Podcast. That's coming up. First, I got to tell you about our friends at Home Field Apparel. You can head to homefieldapparel.com right now and search over 130 different schools as well for Home Field Apparel. I've got my, in honor of Bryce Foster, actually, I've got my Kansas Relay shirt on from Home Field for KU. So you can check out KU and 130 other schools as well and get your KU gear before the kickoff. You got 11 weeks. I just said 11 weeks. So you still have a little bit of time, but hey, man, each week we're getting closer and closer. And if you are a first-time customer, you can use promo code KCSN23 for 15% off your first order. That's KCSN23 for 15% off your first order at homefieldapparel.com. Jayhawk Rewind is coming up next here on the Paid Podcast.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
Okay, so as we continue through the offseason here with our offseason series of the Jayhawk Rewind, we're into our fourth game of the season for KU in 2023 as we kind of progressively go through the season up until kickoff of 2024. Kansas is 3-0. You took care of business against Illinois. You escaped Reno, right? Hopefully never have to go back. You escape Reno, you're 3-0, you're feeling good, you're coming back home. It's your conference hall opener against BYU. Their Big 12 conference opener ever as they join the conference. And BYU is an interesting one, Kevin, because they were coming off of a pretty significant win of their own on the road against Arkansas the week before in a game that there was really back and forth. It was a crazy game. There was like punt return, touchdowns, kickoffs. It was craziness. BYU ends up winning. So they're 3-0 also. So BYU's rolling in at 3-0. Kansas is 3-0. What were your thoughts maybe at the beginning of the week heading into this one in Lawrence between the Jayhawks and the Cougars?
Yeah, heading into the season, I circled the Illinois game and BYU game together because BYU has kind of this history of being really physical up front. And we talked about Illinois week. I would recommend checking out that episode. That was a fun one. Heading into the Illinois game, you thought, hey, it's Brett Bielema. It's a Big Ten team. They're going to come out and they're going to try and be really physical. And I really felt like that would be a preview for, if you get manhandled in that game, it's maybe not looking so great heading into the BYU game. You think of all the times over the last, 5-10 years that BYU has played a team, a power conference team and just kind of, pushed them around. And so heading into this one off the Arkansas game, obviously BYU has a lot of confidence from that, starting Keaton Slovis, a quarterback, former USC guy / Pitt. Is that right?
USC, then Pitt, then BYU, which, by the way, that is quite the journey. I mean, forth across the country.
Yeah, and so, you've got Slovis who can throw the ball pretty well, I think. And so it was one of those things where it's like, okay, they passed the physical test against Illinois. You maybe didn't worry about that part as much, but it was still one of those things where you figured Kansas would have to strap on the pads because it was going to be a tough one, and Keaton Slovis was probably going to test Kansas's secondary.
Yeah, I think at the beginning of the year, looking at the KU schedule, the thought was, man, if you could go into Texas at 3-1, you feel pretty good. Well, now you're sitting at 3-0 with BYU in front of you, and I'm thinking, I'm starting to get greedy. I'm like, man, let's just make it 4-0. I mean, why not?
Why not?
Let's get out there and get a win. And so, yeah, I was confident going into this game. BYU's a tough team. They had a great defensive end that ended up being kind of nullified actually in the Kansas game, which we'll get into. They also have a Sua Mataia from who is now playing. I think I got that right. Kingsley Sua Mataia.
Yeah,
I got that right. Who obviously ended up getting drafted in the second round of the Kansas City Chiefs as well. Keaton Slovis is an experienced quarterback. So on paper, I felt that Kansas was going to win this game. I think they were actually double-digit favorites even for the sports books heading in this one. So Vegas was more confident in Kansas as well as this game got started. And as this game got underway, I mean, let's dive into it. Into this game, an interesting start, right? Kansas gets the ball first. They drive down the field pretty effectively, and they get to a 4th and 6. BYU 33. Now, remember, Kansas with Seth Keller, the question was, what kind of distance did he have? You have Owen Peeper Curtis as well. What's that situation like? You get to a 4th and 6 at the 33-yard line of BYU early in this game. Kansas decides to go for it. First off, Kevin, if you remember, what was kind of your initial reaction to them going for it and kind of what happened afterwards?
I didn't mind them going for it, but I would say the play that stood out to me was you get it, to where you only need 1 yard for a first down. You have a false start. Coming off the Nevada game where you kind of had a lot of those little mistakes that just kind of killed drives, you're just thinking, oh my gosh, here it goes again. They wind up calling, I think, a pass to Mason Fairchild. It gets it's incomplete, and all of a sudden, you're sitting here like, man, no points when you went down the field, and they looked pretty good, going down the field. But another drive, again, when we're looking at this sort of in the context of what happened at the time, you're thinking, man, that was a lot like the Nevada game where you drive down and, you don't wind up getting points for it. What was kind of your reaction? Yeah,
I mean, very tough situation, right? I think, you're at home, you get the ball first, you want to go down and kind of get some points off of it. And I initially kind of liked the decision to go for it, right? I mean, I think I mentioned it before, but kind of the comparison to like the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes, like if Jalen Daniels is the best player on the field, give him the ball and see what he could do, right?
Sure.
So I can't say that I hated the decision, but it's one of those ones where there's so many of these in football, obviously, where if it doesn't work, you're like, that it worked. Genius, right?
Well, it would have been a 50-yard field goal, to be fair.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was...
It would have been unlikely. For sure.
It would have been a long kick. But, yeah, I mean, it's one of those where, with any fourth down decision, you're either a genius or, a goat, and not in the, like, greatest of all time sense, depending on whether or not it works out, and people question the play call if it doesn't. But no, I mean, it was a nice little drive, and they wind up not getting anything from it. And then,
yeah. So you're feeling a little disappointed. I remember being at the stadium. The energy was kind of taken out of the stadium because you got a pretty solid drive. You're thinking, well, crap, but BYU gets the ball back, and then 2 plays later, probably one of the plays of the season, certainly one of the plays of the season, and then even looking back at it from now, one of the plays of the season for KU happens, where Kobe Bryant just shot out of a cannon on a jet sweep play that BYU calls just a car crash, causes a fumble, scoops it up, returns it to score, and all of a sudden the fourth down play is forgotten. Who cares? Because it's 7-0. Kobe Bryant just made one of the best plays of the week.
Yeah. It was funny because it took a lot of people by surprise. I mean, if you watch the clip, the announcers are talking about something else, and then they're like, "Oh my gosh, look what happened!" And so it was just an absolute lightning strike of a play by Kobe Bryant. He read it well, and then to not just read it well and make a tackle, he hit him 11 yards in the backfield. So, I mean, obviously it would have been a big play regardless, but to just absolutely pad up on the guy the way that he does, ball squirts free, Kobe Bryant grabs it and scores maybe the easiest touchdown of his entire career, and that includes the West Virginia, overtime pick where there was nobody around him. But gosh, yeah, it's talking about it from a mood standpoint. It was like scoring on your first drive, right?
Exactly.
It was you drove down, you got stopped, and then all of a sudden Kobe makes sure you have the points anyway.
Yeah. And the cool thing is, Kobe Bryant obviously is not the biggest guy in the world, right? I mean, he certainly is more known for his coverage skills. And to see him come make a play like that, I thought was pretty special. It ended up being a top 5 play on SportsCenter that week, I'm pretty sure, as well. So, yeah, that sort of reignited the entire stadium and the energy of everything, right? I mean, you get stopped on a fourth down, but now that's kind of wiped clean with the play by Kobe Bryant. But honestly, Kevin, a really good response from BYU. They go on a 10-play drive when they get the ball back, and they go down and end up scoring a touchdown to make it 7-7. So a nice response from BYU overall to kind of to bounce back and make it 7-7 in the first quarter. And then Kansas has maybe one of their best drives of the day, which they go 8 plays for 86 yards in 4 minutes. There was a couple plays there. They got helped out by a holding call. There was a couple passes to Quentin Skinner, including over a 21-yard pass for Skinner on the second drive for Kansas. And it results in a touchdown pass to Trevor Cardell. And if Trevor Cardell obviously is a guy that I think we've touched on quite a bit this spring, because he is a player that you now expect, with the absence of Mason Fairchild leaving the program and with the injury to Deshaun Hanika, Trevor Cardell now suddenly becomes sort of thrust into this role of the leading receiving tight end, right? We talked about Jared Casey and kind of what his role is. And, he's a great, sort of secondary player as a receiver on a tight end position, but he's not really going to be your main guy. And now Trevor Cardell has an opportunity to step up. And on this play, if you go back and watch this play, it's a fantastic catch. It's sort of over the back shoulder. He makes the catch for a touchdown. So, hopefully that's a little bit of taste of what Cardell could bring in 2024.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because on the first drive, you had, Jalen being really patient and then finding Jared Casey for like a 24-yard gain. And then on the second drive, on this drive, you wind up connecting with Trevor Cardell. You're talking about your 2 tight ends for this year. And the way that they're going to do it. Cardell, a lot of people forget, he was a high school wide receiver. And so obviously that's many, many pounds ago, with him growing it into a tight end. But at the same time, he is somebody that still has those receiving skills and can be utilized in that fashion. Really good drive, really good response. BYU was kind of helped on the previous drive too. If you remember, they had an offside call, I guess, on like a 3rd and 5 that gave them a first down. And and let him drive down. So again, another mistake, but then you respond and go right back down. And at this point, I remember thinking Jalen Daniels looked really comfortable, right? Like he was, he dropped back, he was poised. There were some plays where he held onto the ball for quite a while and didn't force anything. And so at that point, you felt like, hey, Jalen's having a nice day as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the balance was there from Kansas also. Devin Neal had a couple of great plays, kind of like a screen pass, and also with running the ball as well. So, but Kansas offense was pretty balanced. And then BYU comes back again and answers again. It was 14-7. Kansas was up. End of the first quarter. BYU takes another long drive. And again, another drive that I think was helped by a couple of penalties. And the interesting thing is, you had mentioned kind of in the lead up to this game, BYU being a more physical team and maybe expecting them to try to run the ball a little bit more. That wasn't the case at all. They really relied very heavily on Keaton Slovis in this game. They had virtually no success rushing the ball at all on this Kansas team. Keaton Slovis ended up throwing the ball 51 times. So that was something that was really interesting as the game unfolded, watching BYU sort of just completely abandon their run game. And it did have some success. It ended up, they allowed them to score another touchdown here to make it 14-14. But as you're watching this game, Kevin, seeing that A, KU was completely stifling BYU's run, and B, seeing BYU abandon that for the pass, what was maybe your reaction to their strategy as the game went on?
Well, and if you remember, like Slovis was really dealing in that first half. I mean, there were a couple balls fit into kind of tight spots. I think their first touchdown drive, he hit their tight end Rex like on 3 consecutive plays. I mean, he was spreading the ball around, and Slovis had those moments at USC, and so you're kind of sitting there. I feel like at this point it's 14-14, and you're like, oh my gosh, this could wind up being a shootout because Slovis is just really dealing right now, and it's one of those where you wondered if you were going to have enough answers defensively. With how quick they were getting the ball out, it took Kansas's pass rush kind of out of it a little bit. I mean, they wound up, I think, with 3 sacks on the day, which doesn't sound bad, but when a guy throws it 51 times, is maybe not as often. And there wasn't a lot of pressure on him because of the way that they were getting rid of the ball. And so you wondered kind of what the adjustments would be for that defense.
Yeah, and then in the midway through the second quarter and towards the end of the second quarter, the pace of the game really changed. Both offenses kind of ran into a wall on both sides. KU had a couple of drives killed by penalties. They had a holding on one drive that resulted in a punt. They went to 3-and-out. BYU also had a 3-and-out as well. So you're kind of still deadlocked at 14. And then later in the quarter, BYU then eventually does get something going. They got a personal foul actually deep in their own territory against Kansas that kind of helped BYU kickstart another drive with time expiring in the second quarter. And they go down. They eventually do find a way to get a field goal out of it. So all of a sudden, BYU is up 17-14, and you're going into half. And yeah, I think the mood was definitely nervous at that time for Kansas at half because the offense was really strong early, but you had some really on both sides of the ball, offense and defense. You had some penalties that hurt you, and BYU's got the lead at half. So I would say the mood was a little bit nervous maybe at the booth at that point.
Yeah, I mean, he's thrown for almost 175 yards at this point. He's been really accurate. I think he was 19 for 27 at that point, and with 2 touchdown passes, and you're just kind of thinking at half again, what's the adjustment going to be? I do think coaches talk about halftime adjustments being a little bit overrated, in terms of, hey, they usually try and adjust before halftime, when things are going wrong. But at the same time, you did think they were going to need to make some decisions on how they were going to defend BYU and maybe try to change this thing. And to their credit, they did make some nice adjustments. I think Rex had finished with 7 catches. Only 2 came in the second half. Yeah, and
major correct. Yeah.
Yeah, they targeted him 7 times in the second half and got 2 catches. So, they kind of shut off the faucet there. A couple other BYU guys wound up catching him for a big play here or there. But Slovis, I don't think, threw a touchdown the rest of the game, did he?
No, BYU didn't even They got a rushing touchdown, I think, later in the second half. But
yeah, that's what.
But yeah, I mean, the big adjustment, Kevin, the big adjustment at halftime was Kenny Logan.
Yes,
going out and getting a pick six to start this second half for Kansas. I mean, that was the big adjustment right away. 3 plays into the second half, Kenny Logan gets a pick six off of Keaton Slovis. And again, just like in the first half with Kobe Bryant, sort of reigniting the stadium, reigniting the energy of the game with the fumble six after Kansas got stopped on 4th down. Same deal. You're coming out of halftime. You just give it up a field goal at the end of the half for BYU to take the lead, and the energy was a little bit nervous. And here comes Kenny Logan to sort of reignite everything with a pick six 3 plays into the half.
Yeah, you had 3 straight pass breakups. I think O.J. Burrows broke up the first pass play, then Craig Young broke up a pass play for Rex, and then Kenny Logan housed one. And so all of a sudden you go from, man, you can't get this quarterback off the field. And, one of the things that Slovis was doing was he was kind of dining on those short to intermediate throws. And they really, I think, finally had to make a decision and say, we're not going to give you that really safe stuff to be able to throw anymore. You're going to have to work more, to move the ball down the field. We're not going to let you get into 2nd and 4, 3rd and 2, whatever else. And obviously when you score multiple touchdowns on defense, that's going to help you. The other adjustment, though, on the other side of the ball, Kansas really started getting downhill with that running game. And, we talked about in the Illinois game how they kind of attacked the angles, right? Because Illinois played 3 defensive tackles basically together. And so they got those guys moving and kind of made them have to play in space in ways that they weren't comfortable. Against BYU, they lined up and said, we are more physical than you, and we are going to run the ball. Ran the ball 25 times in the second half for 172 yards.
Yeah, I mean, the pace really changed in the second half for the Kansas offense because I think they started to realize, hey, we just put together a couple of drives here. We're going to win this game because of the way the defense has helped out with the touchdowns. And there was on the ensuing drive, again, BYU was able to drive down. There was a big play. They had a 2nd and goal against Kansas when Austin Booker comes through with a big sack. We've talked obviously quite a bit about Austin Booker and his emergence. But even still, I mean, at this point in the season, if you can go back, did you still get the sense that he was going to become the player he would become at that point? Did you see it at that point? Or was it just more of a, hey, this guy's flashing a little bit here?
I think it was one of those where you realized that he was having flash plays. You wondered if the consistency would come maybe a little bit. I mean, there were times, at least on tape, where he was out of position. This is a guy that wasn't very experienced coming into Kansas, hadn't played a whole lot in Minnesota. And so there were some times where you'd look at it and you'd say, oh my gosh, like that looks like a really big time play. And then a couple plays later, you'd look at it and say, that looks like a guy who hasn't seen the field very often in terms of where's he going? What's he doing? It was that whole meme, though. What's this guy cooking? Or whatever. And so, that was a huge play, though. Gets BYU, obviously way behind the sticks because of the sack. And BYU winds up having to get a field goal. They still get points on the board, but Kansas still keeps the lead. It's 21-20 at that point.
Yeah, like you said, at that point it's 21-20. And then you touched on the rushing attack. Well, that really came to life for Kansas on their next drive, in which they had 3 different players with rushes of 8 or more yards. You had Daniel Highshot with a long run. You had Jalen Daniels with a 17-yard run. Dylan McDuffie got involved with a 14-yard run on the next drive for Kansas as they really went right down the field. And then one of the better plays, I think, really of the season from Jalen Daniels to Luke Grimm on the touchdown pass, a 5-yard touchdown. It was one of those deep fades to the corner. And it was just a fantastic catch. And I think it really illustrated the connection that Jalen Daniels and Luke Grimm have. You think about Luke Grimm's season last year, and after Jalen Daniels got hurt, he was still effective, obviously, and still made some great plays, but just maybe didn't quite have the same connection with Jason Bean that he has with Jalen Daniels. So honestly, one thing that I am just really excited about, and hopefully we get to see more of this season, is the Jalen Daniels to Luke Grimm connection, because those two specifically, I feel like have a very, very special connection apart from everybody, all the other receivers that Kansas has.
Yeah, I think he's got a lot of chemistry with Jared Casey, too. I think you've seen Casey's production go up when he's playing with Jalen Daniels. But I 100% agree in that those two seem to have a real connection. How's this for a stat line? Kansas, again, lines up and runs the ball in the second half. Jalen runs the ball really well in the second half. He's part of that running attack. I think he had back-to-back first down carries on the drive that we were just talking about. But Jalen's passing stats in the second half, he attempted all 4 passes, completed all 4, 2 were for touchdowns. I think,
well, I'm excited to get into
Kansas is typically going to want Jalen to carry a bigger load as a passer than throwing the ball 4 times over 2 quarters. But he didn't misfire on any of them, and 2 went for scores. That's about as good as you could ask for.
Yeah, I'm really excited once we get to the UCF game because something similar happened with Jason Dean in the second half of that game.
Sure.
But yeah, Kansas really just put their nose down and decided to run. And something interesting about this game, you mentioned Jalen Daniels running the ball, and I don't know if we specifically talked about this on this podcast here, but with the switch of coordinators, with Jeff Grimes coming in, and with the now injury history that you have at Jalen Daniels, this is kind of just a long-term question that I think won't get answered really until we see it in action. I'm just curious about how much this Kansas team is going to utilize the run game with Jalen Daniels specifically this season. When you have a change in coordinator, Jeff Grimes, who may be less of an option type coordinator, and on top of that, I don't know how you couldn't be Lance Leipold to Jeff Grimes. And every time you call an option player, running play for Jalen Daniels, you can be thinking in the back of your mind, gosh, is this the last play we're going to have him for the season because of his injury history?
Yeah, it becomes, somewhat of a business decision, right? In terms of, hey, do we really need /want to run Jalen here? And that's going to be a question they're going to have to answer. And I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I do think that, one, they probably would have seen less option this year anyway, going from Kotelnicki to Grimes. And then you add in, hey, you got to keep Jalen Daniels healthy. That might nip it in the bud a little bit more. And so you do have to decide, like, how important is this play? Is it the sort of thing where, you need to make use of his legs on this play? Do you want him taking unnecessary shots? And so option is going to be part of the playbook. It really is. I do wonder, late in the year when you had the injuries to Jason Bean, you saw them continue to run option stuff, but do it with multiple running backs and kind of a wildcat look. I wonder if that's going to be sort of the happy medium that we wind up seeing, where they're still going to have some option games, still make people have to prepare for and defend that, but it's going to be, Devin Neal at quarterback on those carries versus Jalen Daniels. I wonder if that's going to be sort of how they're going to utilize it and run it.
Well, this game against BYU, that touchdown pass from Daniels to Grimm, like I mentioned, made it 28-20 at that point for Kansas. And then BYU goes down, and they end up with a 4th and 7 at the KU 34, and they opted to go for it, and ultimately Kobe Bryant gets an interception and really solidifies himself as, such a great player for Kansas, with the forced fumble early in the game and now the interception, which at that point you're thinking, all right, if you go down and score a touchdown here, this game probably should be wrapped up. You're getting late into the third quarter at that point. And that's pretty much what Kansas does off the interception. They get the ball once again, and they go down and score 7 plays in about 4 minutes. Again, utilizing the run game. Both Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw had runs of over 10 yards on that drive. And it's another touchdown pass to Luke Grimm from Jalen Daniels. And now it's 35-20 KU at that point, and you're feeling pretty good about where you're at if you're Kansas.
Yeah, I think when you look at the second half and what they did offensively, they only really had 3 drives, and they wound up getting 17 points off those 3 drives. You had 2, touchdown drives, and then you wind up, getting the field goal at the end. And that last drive might have been my favorite. We'll touch on that in just a minute. But at the same time, what a way to respond to kind of being punched in the mouth overall, to come out, you're trailing, then you get it to, BYU gets it to 21-20. You score on back-to-back touchdown drives. You're showing physicality. You're running the ball and doing the things. And you wind up, like you said, adding another touchdown pass to Luke Grimm to kind of stretch this thing out and make it comfortable for you at least for a minute. And then, of course, BYU has their next drive.
Yeah, BYU did not go down without a fight. They end up going on a long, grinding drive that featured a pass interference against Kansas on a long third down. They also had, I think Kansas had another penalty against them on that drive as BYU went down, and eventually they do score a touchdown, 12 plays, 75 yards. They get a touchdown out of it with a 6-yard touchdown run to make it to 35-27 at that point. Kansas still up by 8, so you're still feeling pretty confident. There's about 7 minutes left in the game at this point, 8 minutes left in the game at this point when BYU scores. So I think, like you alluded to, I think this next drive, the reason why it's your favorite is because Kansas did what all great coaches want their teams to do. You have a lead late in the game, and you're just going to run it, and run some more, run the clock, run the ball. Kansas goes down. Kevin, they take a 6.5-minute field goal drive. Now, listen, under normal circumstances, if you hear 6.5-minute field goal drive, you are ripping your hair out. I mean, that is like your worst nightmare. Well, for 6.5 minutes, he could score a touchdown, but in this particular situation, it was perfect for Kansas. They had an 8-point lead. They take all that time. They go down the field to make it a 2-possession game, and you're thinking, all right, this one is done and dusted.
Yeah. I mean, it was, you described it perfectly. I mean, to line up in that situation where they know you want to run the ball, you know you want to run the ball. And that was one of the questions kind of heading into the season, right? We talked about this on one of our earlier episodes. Kansas wasn't able to run the ball on Arkansas when Arkansas knew that Kansas wanted to run the ball. And so that was one of the things that they wanted to fix in the offseason was, hey, when we know we're running and you know we're running, can we run? And Kansas did just that. And like you said, in that drive, the clock is so much more important than the points. The points were important because it made it a 2-possession game. Yeah. But you didn't necessarily need a touchdown. What was fantastic was just 12 plays, 6.5 minutes, grind it all down, and that was pretty much, I mean, all she wrote. I mean,
BYU got the ball back in the middle.
Lines up,
they got the ball back around it. Yeah,
and that was pretty much it. And so for a final drive, if your coach is going out there looking at the clock and saying, hey, there's 8 minutes left, that was about as perfect a drive as you could ask for.
Yep. So Kansas, as you said, BYU gets the ball back with about a little over a minute and a half left. They don't really do much. The game ends. KU gets the win, 38-27. Kansas is 4-0 for the first time since Vietnam, I think. I'm kidding. Well, maybe. I don't know.
Since the previous year. They started 5-0.
Oh, that's right. I'm an idiot. Yeah, they did start 5-0 in 2022. Okay, well, they start 4-0 again, and you're feeling great. They got the win at home against BYU. You got 2 defensive touchdowns. The offense did its job late in the game. Now you got the big one with Texas coming up. What was your thoughts sort of after this game with KU getting the win?
Yeah, actually, I booked tickets to go out. For those of you who don't know, I used to cover Texas and used to live in Austin. And so with it being Kansas's last ever trip to Austin, decided.
I don't think Texas wants to schedule Kansas based on the history there.
It's probably on the do not schedule list for Texas. But no, the wife and I, we booked tickets and got tickets to the game and decided to head down, because with Jalen Daniels as your quarterback, anything is possible. And so obviously 2 years prior, Jalen was terrific when, Kansas was able to upset Texas and Austin, a game that really sort of, kick-started the building job by Lance Leipold. And so thought it could be a fascinating game. And you're sitting there 4-0, you're ranked, you're right where you want to be. I think a lot of us, and I from what I remember, you were included in this, a lot of us thought Texas was going to win the Big 12 and thought that for all of Texas's previous year's issues or whatever else, that Steve Sarkisian had solved a lot of those. And so you felt like, hey, if Kansas legitimately has Big 12 designs, and remember, the previous year, L.J. Arnold said, I believe right before the Arkansas game, that, hey, we want to compete for Big 12 titles. this was going to be a really sort of big game on that path. And so a clash of titans with undefeated records, heading into that one. And at the same time, you didn't know if this would maybe be a little bit of a trap game for Texas because it was the week before Texas plays OU at the State Fair in Dallas. And so, you're heading out of the BYU game excited, and yet at the same time, you're thinking, man, like this upcoming week, that's going to be a big one.
Yeah, I think my thoughts, we'll talk more about this with the Texas game, obviously next week on the next Jayhawk Rewind, but just real quickly, my thoughts was, hey, listen, you're 4-0, but Texas will be a litmus test, right?
Sure.
To see how good you are. Where are you exactly? Because Texas had gone out and beaten Bama at that point. Yeah. So you knew they were a legit top 5 team. You're going to be going on the road. You got a big win against BYU. You're feeling good, but certainly was going to be a challenge. So, and as I said, we'll be talking. That's a great teaser, by the way, Kevin. As we'll be talking more about the KU Texas game on the Jayhawk Rewind on next week's edition of the Paid Podcast here. But that's it for us here this week with the Jayhawk Rewind, and also some recruiting updates with Bryce Foster and other things as well for this episode. If you liked what you heard or watched, if you were listening on, or if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment, give us a like and subscribe as well. Give us 5-star ratings and reviews on Spotify podcast, wherever you're listening, as it helps us spread out there. And leave us some comments on what maybe your thoughts were as we go through the 2023 season, kind of refreshing the memory a little bit before you get ready for the 2024 season. That's it for this edition of the Paid Podcast here. I'm Nick Springer with Kevin Flaherty. We will talk to you again soon. See ya.